an assistant professor in the Department of Classics at UCLA, with training in archaeology, ancient history, and digital humanities. As well as having worked in the tech and nonprofit spaces, she takes an interdisciplinary and collaborative approach to both her teaching and her research. She is committed to bridging the academy and the community, and especially strives to uplift those who are from underrepresented and under-resourced backgrounds. Let's please give a warm welcome to Kelly Nguyen.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here on Saturday morning. I want to echo again all of the thanks for the organizers. I grew up just 25, 30 minutes south of here in Westminster, Little Saigon. So it's with extreme pride that I'm presenting here and a part of the CCA Southern branch, which I didn't even know existed until this year, to my shame, but now to my pride. So thank you for having me. Very excited to share with you this class that I just started. Just created and started teaching last spring, but hopefully it's going to run annually. It's going to run again, a different iteration of it at UCLA this spring as a part of the Digital Humanities program's offerings. So quick overview of the talk. I'm going to discuss the course, kind of the inspiration behind it, what it consists of, the contents, discuss some of the successes and the challenges, different ways that I'm thinking about changing it. And then thinking about next steps as well. I'll also be introducing a project that I just launched called the Refugee Material Culture Initiative that is a community engaged project, but more on that in a bit. So part of the inspiration for this came about from seeing so many different public discourses on forced displacement and specifically talking about refugees that pulled on the ancient world. So these are just a few examples you can see here. We could ask Euripides about refugees, talking about Virgil's Aeneid and anti-immigrant sentiments, obviously always recalling on ancient Rome and the barbarians at the gate. The refugee crisis that doomed the Roman Empire. Of course, Boris Johnson, how can we leave him out when we're talking about anti-immigration and pulling on the Romans, right? And then thinking about how migrants are sinking and the differences between who we call migrants and who we call refugees. But it wasn't just this public discourse that I saw that was really on the concerning end of things, right? Thinking about how classics is being misused in this way, but I also saw how classics could be used in a way that is more about showcasing the issues that are at hand, right? And bringing nuance to it and bringing the humanity into it. So just a few examples here. For example, this Raft of Lampedusa by Jason Descartes Taylor, right, showing this raft with actually the statues themselves are made from casts of refugees who had come to Lampedusa. And then another example, of course, is the famous Safe Passage by Ai Weiwei. And here he's using some of the actual, all of these actually are the actual life vests from refugees coming to the Mediterranean. And he's wrapped it around these different columns, right? These Ionic columns that are, for example, at the Berlin Concert Hall, and then the one, and then it kind of traveled around Europe, including in the US as well, around these different spaces that render and conjure, right, these Greco-Roman ideals and motifs and traditions, and making us really think about these comparisons that we're making alongside these contemporary issues. So I saw that it could be used in this really problematic way, but it also could be used in this really liberatory way, right? And then I also saw the kind of convergence of that, where the refugees are using classical references themselves. And so this monument is a monument that was put up by the Vietnamese refugee community in Australia, in Brisbane, Australia. And you can see that it's a bronze statue of a Vietnamese woman in traditional clothing. She has even the traditional canonical hat that is called the Nong La. And she's wearing more of the clothing of those from the lower socioeconomic status. She's facing one way, her hand to a dove, as if looking towards hope. And she's holding a little boy's hand who's facing the other way. The question is, which way are they facing? Is the boy facing towards Vietnam or facing away? Is she facing away or towards Vietnam? Which one represents hope, right? But what they represent is, and what the statue is dedicated to is it's in memory of all those who have died at sea, all those Vietnamese refugees who have died at sea trying to find freedom. And what's interesting here is that there's a quotation from Euripides' Medea: "There is no greater sorrow than the loss of one's native land." What I want to point out here, which all of you classicists surely noticed already, is a misspelling of Euripides, right? And that's actually a typological error, because you see that in the bigger image, there's two sides. There's an English translation and then the original Vietnamese inscription. And it's actually spelled correctly in the original Vietnamese translation, and that it's only misspelled in a typological issue in the English one. But it's interesting because I've presented this at different institutions of higher education, and I had never pointed that out before. I just wanted to see what people would say, right? And they would raise it and raise, of course, the issue of, are you sure these Vietnamese refugees knew what they were interacting with? Are you sure that they read Euripides, right? And really questioning their engagement with the classics. And then when I showed them the other side, that's when everyone is stunned to silence. But that's on the the visual side, the artistic side, showing a little bit more nuance, asking questions of, well, what, for example, does Medea represent for those who are facing death, right? The decision between freedom and death, and kind of the relationship between the two. But there's also other ways that refugee lives have been misrepresented. And that's, for example, in thinking about the misuse of refugee data. So this is just one example of the misuses. In this project, the Lucify project, they're collecting all of this data about the sheer numbers of people who have left or arrived in a certain European country. Let me try to play this. So this is the visualization. So you see the issue here of when there's no context and it looks like it's just a flow of people from the global south invading the global north, right? It's visualizations like this that make people so concerned about the influx, right, of migrants. And then you lose even the word refugee, depending on who it is that you're, depending on what the rhetoric is, right, and the ideologies you're trying to harp on here. So thinking about these different ways that refugees have been misrepresented, misunderstood, the ways that classics have been conjured, right, for these different messages here, the questions came up of, well, how do we counter these misuses of the references, about of classical references in discussing forced displacement? How can we counter the mishandling of refugee data, like the visualization that I showed you, that strips away the humanity of refugee lives? And how do we counter then the misrepresentations of refugee experiences in its fullness, in its complexity, in its diversity? And the biggest question of all is, how can the academy and the community work together to create educational resources that help the public better understand refugee lives and uplift refugee agency? And so the course emerged out of this, right? Emerged of a desire to tackle these issues and to learn alongside my students. And so what we looked at in the course was both the literary and the material record, and with a focus on specifically the ancient Greco-Roman world because of my specialty, and also the contemporary Vietnamese diaspora because of my background, because I am a Vietnamese refugee. And so we discuss how refugees have been discussed, portrayed, and treated, and then we also flip the script, right, to look at how refugees talk about their experiences themselves, and about their perspectives, and incorporating that. And so here is a meeting, right, this nexus of classical studies, critical refugee studies, and digital archaeology, which I'll get to in a little bit, about how we bring that in and how we bring the community in, and which leads to the last bullet point, which is that students got to work on a selection of actual artifacts that have been digitized from the Vietnamese refugee community. And so alongside this class that I was developing, I was also launching this initiative called the Refugee Material Culture Initiative. And this is a community engaged project, and we had 3 specific goals in mind. And this is thinking about how can material culture help us, and this is from my archaeology background, right? How can material culture help us to better understand these different aspects of refugee lives and help tell their stories, right? Help make it a bit more accessible. So there's multiple issues here as well, is that a lot of the projects that have already been out there trying to preserve refugee narratives have been from oral tradition. We do incorporate some of that too, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but so little about the material culture themselves until it's been lost to time, and then we archaeologists go out and try to recover it, right, and try to retell that story. But then what we lose alongside that is the perspective from the refugee side. And so as the generation of refugees, specifically focusing at this initial stage on the Vietnamese refugee community, as the older generation is starting to move on, right? A lot of the materials that they have brought with them are starting to be thrown away, the younger generation not knowing what to do with it. So we're thinking, this is where it came up of, we need to think of a way to digitally preserve it digitally so that it can be accessible to those not just in the community who can come by, for example, to a community museum, which I'll talk about in a bit, but also to those globally, right? And this was a way to preserve it that was also economical, because conservation is also a big issue, which I'll also get into. So the 3 goals was to digitally preserve the art and artifacts made by and used by refugees, to create this free and accessible database of the digital outputs that we made, and then to generate educational resources on refugee histories. And this last bullet point that the class kind of fits into. So our community partner at this first initial stage is a Vietnamese Heritage Museum, which is just in Santa Ana, 30 minutes south of here if you'd like to visit it. But we invited them up to UCLA. This is us at VHM and the project team members at the Coates Institute of Archaeology. This was our first community day, because from the beginning of the project, we wanted to incorporate their feedback. We invited them up, showed them the different technologies that were available that we could use, talked about how they wanted their stories to be presented, what were their goals. For example, what kind of metadata do we make public, right, available to the public, and what is too private that we want to hold back, right, is these different negotiations. So they were involved from the beginning of this project to think about the goals of the project and how we execute it along the way. And that's us analyzing some of the artifacts that they had brought up for the first sample batch of digitization. But in the class, so those are the artifacts that the students were working with, and the community members that the students were interacting with. In the class, these are just an example of the weekly themes that we looked at. And the work that kind of framed the theoretical framework of the class was critical refugee studies. And this introduction to critical refugee studies actually had just come out the year before, which was very convenient for me and really helpful. I put a picture of the book, the front of the book here, the cover, so you can see it. I highly recommend it. It's definitely very accessible and helps to explain the different tenets of critical refugee studies. And so that frames the class in helping us think about, the first week we think about data, artifacts, and memory work, right? So for example, that misuse of the data in that visualization I show you, right? What happens when you strip the human from the data? And then how do we infuse back more of an ethical approach to memory work? And then we think about the themes of law and refuge, fear and asylum, humanitarianism. That comes from departures. And so I kind of then put different chapters of departures throughout, just kind of spread it out throughout the different weekly themes so that you can see what the theoretical framework was. What are the driving questions, right? And then I matched it with different works from antiquity alongside those stories that were written by refugees from different communities, as well as some more historical background on specifically the Vietnamese refugee case. So just as an example, when we're talking about refugees and empire, right? Of course, then I'm bringing in the idea of the mythological foundations of the Roman Empire then, and we read Virgil's Aeneid. which then is the first half, right? And then we think about resettlement and VEX solidarities. VEX solidarities being a term that was coined by my colleague at UCLA, Evanlea Espiritu Gandhi, in her work on Vietnamese refugees in Guam and Israel, Palestine, and thinking about, well, what happens when you're a refugee and you're resettled in a place that also has to deal with settler colonialism. And so that's what she calls these VEX solidarities. And of course, that's thinking about the second half of the Aeneid, right? What happens when he lands on the Italian peninsula? But we can, in Q&A, we can discuss that a little bit more about how I match these different works, for example. But it really helped in helping students think about not only the contemporary issues, but then have that little bit of that separation, right? When we're talking about the ancient world, and specifically thinking about these concepts that come from the ancient world, but are totally different in our modern world. For example, the concept of asylum, right? Or supplication, and the very concept of refugee itself. The biggest question being, could we even apply the concept as we understand it today in the modern world and the ancient world? What are for example, the performances of refugeehood in the ancient world? And how can understanding these performances of refugeehood in the ancient world help us to reconsider our very limited definition of refugee in the modern world? Some of the different course materials, these are the other textbooks, right? For example, Toward a Framework for Vietnamese American Studies. This also just came out last year, so everything is very apropos. And the different chapters that help students contextualize the Vietnamese refugee artifacts came from, for example, that edited volume. Of course, then we also read Shadi Barsh's translation of the Aeneid, and the Aeneid being one of the major ancient texts that we engage with. But I try to mix different literary texts, material culture, scholarly essays, oral history, and visual arts, like some of the ones I showed you, for example, by Ai Weiwei. Different media, right? Academic ones, scholarly ones of essays, as well as public-facing essays. We had videos and podcasts, hearing from the refugees themselves, and different digital platforms that have shared, refugee stories. And of course, then the learning outcomes of this is that students will be able to articulate a more nuanced understanding of the portrayal and treatment of forcibly displaced peoples in the ancient and modern world. They'll be able to analyze material culture and literary works alongside each other in contrast to each other, and then critique the politics of displacement. We're looking at it intersectionality, through the lens of intersectionality, right? Thinking about race, ethnicity, gender as well, colonialism, imperialism. And engage in discussions of forced displacement in this, not just a comparative manner, but a reflective manner, more of an ethical manner. And then be able to communicate these ideas, these really complicated ideas, to broad audiences. Some of their assignments were written, oral, and visual. I wanted to just touch briefly on two of the assignments that they had. One is the personal exhibit. And so in the class, we have different labs so that they can apply some of the different technologies, the different platforms, right? And see what works best. For example, learning how to 3D scan something. But what was really important before we get to the final project was that they understand why it was important to take this more ethical approach, right? And this more humanistic approach to refugee data. And so I had them create their own exhibit. And the prompt was, you have to leave tomorrow and go on your own refugee journey. You don't know where you're going, you just know you have to leave. And you have to take, what would be the 10 things that you take with you? Right? And then they had to create an exhibit. They had to think about how would you have these 10 things, and now you're creating an exhibit for it. How would you want to talk about those 10 things? How would you want those 10 things to be portrayed to people? What do you want others to be able to see? What is too personal that you want to censor, right? And so all of those questions are in mind. And then all of that they have reflected on a personal level before then they work directly with the actual artifacts from the Vietnamese refugee community. And that's the final project where they worked in teams and they made a comparative refugee exhibit, a digital exhibit And I'll show some examples of that in a bit, where the prompt was to shed some light, some aspect of the refugee issues we've been looking at, right? Maybe, for example, the one I'm going to show you is gendered representations of refugeehood. And that's the comparative aspect, is to then put the Greco-Roman materials we've been looking at alongside the Vietnamese refugee materials. How are you going to compare the two in a way that then brings nuance to these issues, right? But the charge, and what I really stressed, was that it can be really dangerous to bring in the Greco-Roman classical materials because of the cultural value it has already, right? And that it can easily eclipse these other artifacts. So they had to really be sensitive to that. How are you comparing it in these two different sets of materials in a way where one doesn't eclipse the other, that two work on the same plane together to drive at the message that you're trying to get across. So this is one example. This is built on Omeka. Omeka, as it turns out, is really difficult to work with, even though it's something that, you know, a lot of different museums, for example, and different archives use as their platform. I think I'll talk about in a little bit about the issues, but this, just so you know, was built on Omeka. We're probably going to change it this year, but this is one of the examples of a student project. So you see it opens up with this prisoner's uniform. And this was a prisoner's uniform of someone, as you can read here, a lieutenant from a special police force under the Republic of Vietnam. And then they asked you to take a moment to imagine this lieutenant general, right? What do you think this lieutenant general, who was in prison for 13 years, look like to you? And this is really to challenge your unconscious bias. Oops. So this is actually the general. She's like 5 feet. And this is the Swan, or in Vietnamese, the Thiên Nga, were a special police force of women for South Vietnam. So they go into her background and her history and the different things that she had, the different artifacts that she had donated and we had digitized. We also have oral history from her. We had conducted an interview as well with VHM. And then they're going into thinking about gendered representations in the Aeneid. But this is all online, so you can check it out on your own time. I just wanted to give you a quick run through of what a sample student project looked like, and kind of how they pulled together literary evidence as well as material culture ones. That razor was made in a re-education camp by repurposed materials. There was a lot of actually different, you can check out the archive online, which I'll show you in a bit, different materials that were made found in re-education camps by prisoners there, by things, for example, like bomb shards that were then remade into gifts. So for example, like this diary of from a Vietnamese refugee man, he had written in prison, in a Thai prison. We had copied all of the pages inside, but it's not available to the public. And then they have some closing remarks for contemplation. But I wanted to now go and talk about the successes and the challenges. What was really great about this kind of class, where you bring in, you know, the technology alongside things like literature and history, is that you get a mix of different students. I had students who are classics, really classics, not majors, but people who had studied and taken different classes in classics. This year, I hope to have some more majors by having the class be cross-listed in classics. This last year, it was only in digital humanities and was a capstone for the digital humanities minor. But we had a mix of different students. Students really enjoyed the comparative aspect. There were a majority of students had no exposure to the classics at all. And that, I think, thinking about it from their, from their feedback, thinking about it from the ancient world really helped them question their own biases, their modern biases, and then vice versa as well. And then framing the class with critical refugee studies also was really helpful in thinking about the different, for example, different aspects that we should be considering, the different theoretical frameworks that we should be considering, and then just kind of making it into bite-sized pieces like that. And students really enjoyed and responded well to the hands-on lab work, for example, the 3D digitizing work, exploring different platforms to think about how they wanted to present their exhibits. And then the experimental nature of their personal exhibit. So going through that, building that personal exhibit really helped them to think about how they would deal with the actual artifacts themselves, and to not just think of it as an assignment, right? Because they knew that their exhibits would be made public and would be a part of the Refugee Material Culture Initiative and would serve as an educational resource for the wider public. And I really do hope that, for example, K through 12 classrooms will be able to use it. But the challenges are also then emerge from some of the successes, right? Because there was a mix of these different students, their different levels of classical education, ended up having to, because of that, you have to have a baseline of understanding. So there was a lot more lecturing that I tend to like to do in class. I like to have it be more of discussion, but I needed to provide that basic foundation for everyone. For example, the Medea myth, right? Thinking about Athenian tragedies. And the different levels of technical training was also really, it was vast, even though all the students were digital humanities minors. Because of how the minor worked, they could choose and craft their own pathway. And so they had taken different courses and were more skilled in some technical training than others, right? Skilled in different technologies than others. Some had more coding than others, for example. And then they had different learning styles. Some really enjoyed the deep dive of the literature, right? Having these discussions, doing close readings and comparative readings. And some was just appalled that I asked them to read, right? And so there was a mixed match of things. And some really loved the lab work and the technical thing and diving into that. And others was like, can we get back to the Medea? Right? So it was different learning styles was also a different challenge there as someone who's mainly taught in classics, in the classics classroom. The platform Omeka that I mentioned was clunky and was a steep learning curve for the students. And so we're going to change that this year and probably use story maps being more conducive to storytelling. So we're probably going to do that. And then there was a delay in building the digital archive itself. I launched the initiative, the Refugee Material Culture Initiative, at the same time as teaching this class. And because of so many delays there, it also delayed, the students being able to work with some of the materials. And then there were also all these different interruptions, including, on campus, and students being really worried about their lives and their freedom of speech. And so all of this came to a head where it made it really difficult for students to even focus on this material, at the same time having this material come to life for them, right? For example, thinking about Palestinian refugees in spring of 2024. And so I wanted to share with thinking about sharing the archive that we built out. This just launched a few weeks ago. It really attests to how amazing my colleagues are at UCLA and all the collaborators I have, including Bryn, who is the director of the Digital Archaeology Lab at the Coatson, and Doug Daniels, who's emerging technologies librarian at UCLA, who really helped bring this project together so quickly because we started working on this in the spring. So this is the website that you can check out. This is the landing page. We have 3D models. We have an 3D model of an actual Vietnamese refugee boat that you can go and check out in person in Santa Ana. There's a 3D digital exhibit there as online as well that you can check out. But this is the archive itself with the first 20 artifacts as our sample batch. So that as we think about the process and kind of a trial and error phase, and we're going to continue to digitize more of VHM's collection this year. So we have both, these more professional photographs and the archaeological ones. And then we did, for example, RTI. You can see we have donor description as well in Vietnamese and in English that the donors wrote about the objects that they made. This comb was made from a bomb shard as a gift for his wife. And this is RTI so that it's kind of like moving a flashlight around so you can see the detailing of the engravings themselves and really see the process, right, of how he had engraved this with no tools, crafting tools, for example, from barbed wires of the fence holding him enclosed in the prison camp. And then the timeline of the artifacts themselves and how they moved, where they moved, when they moved. And then you can also check out the exhibits. This includes the 3D exhibits that our team made of the boat. There's a timeline there that you can go through. We worked with the survivors who were on the boat, and this is the exhibit you just saw, but we worked with survivors from the boat to write a narrative of each day at sea. And so when you go through the 3D exhibit, you can see, click through each day and read what happened each day. Something we really strived to do was to work closely with the donors of the artifacts or their descendants to be able to tell their story through their own words. All right. This is just an example of a 3D, another 3D exhibit. This one is of a can. This is the Guigo can that was repurposed and used. This was my dad was actually imprisoned in a re-education camp after the war. And so it's been really meaningful to be able to talk about these things with him as well, because he'll describe how things are made, how he saw people making them, the value of things. He was able to identify things like that. So that, for example, you can read about these different artifacts, but that can included was really valuable. Even though to us it just looks like something so mundane and quotidian, but that can included, you can see there the different camps that the man who had donated recorded, because they would move you around so that you wouldn't know where you were and you couldn't escape. But you can read more about these different artifacts and check them out online at your leisure. And then there's, of course, the boat that I shared. This is the actual boat. This picture is of the 9 survivors on the boat. They all survived. When the boat was brought here to Santa Ana, they'd come back along with their children and grandchildren to see the boat. One person, though, couldn't enter because it was too traumatic. This is the pictures of us coming down. So we try to do both, where we invite the community up to UCLA, and then we also we come down to the community. And so this was a day when we came down and 3D scanned with the community. And that's Doug. We forced him to get inside because we should have to get inside the boat. And this is the 3D exhibit of the boat. You can see the day by day. You can zoom in and out and really be able to see the details. The boat was the first thing we 3D scanned because of conservation issues. This VHM is a community-run, founded and run museum. And so everyone, it's run by volunteers, right? And they have limited funding. It's funded by the community. And so we don't yet have funding to be able to hire a conservationist. But of course, this boat is not used to SoCal weather. And you can already start to see, for example, the glue in the boat that is made from, the sap from a tree from Vietnam, this local tree, and mixed in with different things like different grasses, for example, glue is already starting to pop out and become and pop out, and then the different the woods is already starting to decompose. Last time I came down, I saw a little piece of the boat laying on the ground, and so time is really of the essence to try to preserve it digitally at least, and then have this be a proof of concept so that we can help the museum apply for funding so that they can hire conservationists for the boat. But this boat, why it survives, is because it is a river boat, and it is so rickety that when finally on the 7th day, this French liner passed by, and many boats had passed them, many ships had passed them without stopping to pick them up. And because they were a part of the second wave of Vietnamese refugees, second of 3 waves. This was in the 80s. By that point, the Vietnamese refugee crisis was no longer something that people saw as a humanitarian issue that they wanted to help out with, but more of a crisis that they were trying to avoid. And so all these ships were just passing them by, and you can read about it, until finally this French liner stopped. They tried to put a ladder down for the refugees to climb up on, but it was too dangerous, and it risked capsizing the boat. And so then they just lifted the entire boat onto the liner, and that's the photo you see here of the boat on the liner. And then that liner dropped off the refugees in Japan for them to be processed for asylum, and took the boat back to France. And that's where it was until 2 years ago when it came to Santa Ana. And so I just wanted to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to share this work that is very much a work in process, and something that that's been giving a lot of meaning to me, my students, as well as so much value to the community. And it's just an example I want to present with you all to kind of start to think about, well, what are ways that we can engage the Greco-Roman classical world in a way that doesn't center them? Because there's lots of ways that we've been trying to do this already, but how can we leverage, for example, those at institutional, at institutions like I am at, like UCLA, with all of these resources? How can we leverage those institutional resources that we have, right, to reach out to the community, and then the training that we have in the classics to then be in conversation with these contemporary issues? So thank you.